All right, team, welcome back to the Carb-Appropriate podcast. Today I'm talking with my good buddy, Richie Hardcore.
Hi,
How you
Cliff.
doing?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm doing a million things. Like I'm trying to get ready to go to Melbourne this afternoon and run into the gym. And yeah, life's good, but hectic at the moment.
Which is being who you are, a lot of irons in the fire, former professional fighter, current Muay Thai coach, but more importantly, social change advocate. How did that happen? Like, tell us a little bit about your journey, because we know each other relatively well,
Yeah.
but I don't think I've ever really heard from the horse's mouth the story and that transition from, being a professional fighter to a radio DJ to a social change advocate.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, because you and me met when you moved back from Canada, right? And I was looking for some nutrition advice around making weight, which is the least fun part of fighting.
Shout
And
out to Rob Brown.
yeah, that's right. Rob Brown, what's up, dude? Um, Yeah, so I had all these things going on kind of simultaneously, I guess. So I was doing radio. I did radio at like just our little indie station here in Auckland, BFM, for like 15 years. And then I started doing more national radio. Like I was at Artist Club on 1ZB for a couple of years, filling in, talking about mental health. Um, and at the same time, I was fighting, and I was also coaching in the background of that. And then I got into working in the alcohol and drug space for 6 years for a Ministry of Health funded project at Auckland Council. So had all these things sort of concurrently, and then phased out. They would phase in and out. Do you know what I mean? So when I retired from fighting, the coaching went up, and as obviously my own competition wasn't there anymore. And then when I moved out of working for the Ministry of Health, I went into working for myself as an educator and keynote speaker, and I guess consultant. I know it sounds weird. I'm a consultant, but I'm like I have consultancy as a zero option when I'm sending people invoices. You're paying me for consultancy. It's weird, but yeah. So I guess I had all these things that were interrelated, but separate. And yeah, as I said, like as one thing would drop off, the other thing would go up. So I moved out of working for a bureaucratic organization like Auckland Council, where to working for myself, and it's way better because I'm not really designed to do too much paperwork, like a little bit, but not too much. And I'm so much happier with that. So I do contract work now for the Ministry of Social Development, around reducing gendered violence in our communities, our society. And I work for White Ribbon, and I'm moving back to doing some group work at an organization called Shine, which is a anti-violence organization here in New Zealand. So I'm doing some co-facilitation there with men who are in a program to help them change. Because I think quite often we need to understand that offenders have problems too, and have backgrounds too that have led them to being violent, which doesn't excuse what they've done. But if we want to change things, we need to work with perpetrators as much as we need to work with survivors. So I'm doing that, and I'm in the gym every night, training young fighters and training people for their own fitness and health and wellness journey, and that's people from all walks of life.
You make a really good point there. It's something that I discuss a lot, is that there aren't excuses for the way people behave. Obviously, you don't want to excuse people's, poor behavior, but there are a lot of reasons for it. And I think when we ostracize people and we become too tied up with the outrage against the person, we're almost removing culpability from ourselves and from society for a lot of the situations that help to cause those problems.
Yeah, man, 100%. I think about this more and more. Like when I think about our mental health epidemic, not mental health epidemic, that's the wrong phrasing, our epidemic of suicide, and the huge rise of people who have got depression and anxiety and experiencing all that. While we do have genetic components and lifestyle components, we still live in a broader environment that we're all part of shaping, which is at least in part responsible for that rise. We're all part of society. And if we want people to be better, with their mental health. We all need to be part of changing society, and it's the same when it comes to most problems. But in this instance, gendered violence. In my line of work, we acknowledge that most men aren't violent, but most violence is committed by men, whether that's against women and children or against other men. And what we need is all men to be part of the conversation to change the culture that violence emerges from. So, yeah, it's about bringing people into that conversation. Like, as you rightly pointed out, quite often we don't explore causatives and kind of ostracize people, and that is counterproductive. Whether that's with anything, like whether that's anything that's emotionally polarizing, there tends to be some polarization and some ostracization, and that actually doesn't achieve positive changes. It just creates more dissonance and noise and anger and hatred. And actually, we need to sometimes temper our anger, however righteous it might be. And this is my personal journey, because when I was at university in 26, I was like more painfully self-righteous than I am now. and would just get into like blaming people and shaming people, and you're part of the problem, you don't do this. And actually, we need to turn the finger back on ourselves and focus on ourselves first and foremost, and do our best to unlearn what we believe needs to be unlearned and reprogram ourselves, and then go from there.
Yeah. I mean, we've discussed this a little bit, that the idea that we often online in particular lose nuance and pragmatism, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that's been it's been a real thought exercise for me is the idea of punitive justice versus truly restorative justice. And I think our default position is often just to go straight to punishment. Punish the person, put them in jail, feed them bread and water, don't give them any sort of social connection. That's probably the worst thing we can do. And again, it's removing culpability from all of us as part of society. So what's your sort of thoughts around that idea of punitive versus, restoration and rehabilitation?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. The difficult thing is the application of it, because so I've spoken in prison a little bit, and I've worked with or met men who've been responsible for committing terrible crimes, so like sexual crimes, crimes against children. And there's a part of me which fully understands the desire to just, bring back the death penalty, be punitive to the nth degree. I actually understand that emotional response, but I'm also in this really strange position where I hear all the background of the stories of a lot of the men responsible for committing that violence, and it's like, well, what else were they going to do given the life course that they were set on from the womb? Like if we look at epigenetics, if we look at the family that someone's born into, if we look at fetal alcohol syndrome, if we look at structural racism, if we look at economic deprivation, if we look at how being traumatized by your own sexual abuse is going to affect you, it doesn't excuse the crimes that you go on to commit, but we actually need to address those things if we want to stop those crimes happening in the future. And just locking people up and throwing them away forever doesn't do that. The death penalty doesn't do that. There's always going to be someone or someone's taking that place. So we really need to, I get it, man. Like if someone offended against someone that I had an emotional connection to, despite all the stuff that I know and I'm talking about with you today, my instant emotional response is to perpetrate some sort of violent justice against them, right? Like that's where I go to. And I think a lot of us are the same, but that's not the right way. So I have to temper that desire and be like, okay, well, how do I help the victim and survivor of whatever the crime might be heal in their journey so it doesn't continue to impact them? And that's going to take a long time because trauma can go cellular deep. And how do I help the perpetrator of that crime also heal? So in
And I guess that
a more practical, in a more practical sense, you know, there's organizations like Project Restore who do restorative justice with survivors and perpetrators of sexual violence, where there's this whole process where it brings them into the room together to talk about the impacts and work towards some healing goal, which can be beneficial for some people. Other people, I mean, I'm not saying that some people don't deserve to go to jail. I truly believe they do. Some crimes are reprehensible, and responsibility can emerge from that criminal justice intervention. You know, like that can be a rock bottom that leads people to, oh, yo, I've got a problem. Do you know what I mean? But at the same time, prison's not really, in my understanding of it, and having personal friends who've been to prison, as well as in a professional space, talking with people who are in prison, it's not really a great place for healing. You know, I gave this talk once, and I was talking about, you know, masculinity and the need to be vulnerability, and, you know, we need to put our walls down. And then a guy in a prison, maximum security prison, just goes, oh yeah, onto it, bro, but I can't be vulnerable here because I'm surrounded by gangsters all the time. And I was like, fair point. You know, like,
exactly.
So it's a tough one. Yeah, but I agree with your broader point that we do have too much focus on punitive justice, and that stems out from not just our criminal justice system and how we look at some of those broader social issues that we're talking about, but even our personal lives. You know, like if someone says the wrong thing on the internet, for example, how do we like shame that person and make an example of them and like ostracize them forever? And do you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
And that doesn't lead to people changing, though.
No, and I think that that's also where we need to be really aware of context. And a good example of that, I think, is the debate around Justin Trudeau at the moment. Now, I'm not necessarily a fan or an opponent of Justin Trudeau. I just don't know enough about Canadian politics right now because I don't live there anymore, right?
Yeah.
But the brownface debacle, if we look at it in the context of right now, we would say, well, at best, that's probably tone deaf, right? But if we look at even 5 or 10 years ago, it's not that it was right, because it wouldn't have been a matter of right or wrong. It just wouldn't have been something that an average everyday person would have probably thought about.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think we've all been, you know, we've all done things like that in the past, not necessarily that, but, you know, we've all done things that today we would look at and say, well, that's probably pretty fucked up. But in the context of the time, it wouldn't have been. And to have someone now drag that up and
yeah, dude, I totally
absolutely vilify someone is problematic. And I think a lot of that again stems from a removal of culpability, because the outrage culture that we have, I think there's a big difference between what you talk about and what we've discussed before, which is justifiable outrage versus just absolute outrage in which we just cut people off.
Dude, there's a huge difference between Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein, who've committed crimes of rape and sexual violence historically, and now that's coming to the light. That's a cause for outrage, and that deserves like criminal justice intervention, and, you know, like, I hope survivors and come forwards and press charges and yada yada yada. Like, but that's different from, I believe, what you're saying. Yeah, sure, Justin Trudeau and blackface that's offensive now, but I agree that you're right, and that historically we didn't think about that. You know, like, it's as we come to consciousness that we can take responsibility for what we didn't know. But the fact is, we don't know what we don't know a lot of the time. You know, it's not, and being like, he's a racist today, I think is unfair and a mischaracterization of who he may be. You know, and also, like, I don't know when that photo was taken or whatever. It was probably 10 or 20 years ago or whatever. And like, I am sure people such as Justin Trudeau, myself, yourself, we grow a lot from who we used to be. You know, like whole, you know, like a lot of the work that I do is based on mistakes that I've made. When I'm talking about mental health, you know, that's a lot of that stems from like bad personal decisions that I made a long time ago before I didn't know what I know now. You know, we need to allow people to learn in their recovery. We need to allow people to learn from the mistakes they made. And if we are truly progressive people who want a more equitable, kinder, more just world, we need to actually temper our desire for change with compassion at the same time, instead of holding people up as the enemy. I think there's a lot of people who find their identity, at least their identity online, in the othering of people who've got different worldviews or different experiences. And they get a lot of validation from being the one to bring someone down a peg or call them out. And they're like the hero on the internet for however, do you know?
Yeah.
And that's actually just doesn't actually do much, though, because we already have too much distance between people. We actually need to bring people closer together. You know, we live in a really atomized, isolating society, and that's not how humans are designed to be. And yet, unfortunately, the internet, for all its wonder, like the internet has got great powers for creating positive social change.
Yeah.
It's also at the same time like further disenfranchising us. So I think when you think about people who have made a stupid joke or worn blackface or whatever it might have been, I think we need to like take it in context, as you say, Cliff, and look at the nuances and look at the finer details of that. You know, like Matt, I think it was Matt Damon or someone got in trouble who said for saying we need to look at, there's a difference between wolf whistling at someone and making someone feel uncomfortable and raping them. And that is true. You know, like both are wrong, but we don't need to put someone in jail for wolf whistling at someone. We need to be like, hey man, did you consider that made someone feel scared or intimidated or objectified? And there's a power dynamic with that you need to be mindful of. And you probably didn't know that, bro, at the time that you did that, because you're a product of your environment and you're a product of the culture that we live in that has taught you to objectify women. And that sort of conversation will make a person shift rather than shaming them.
Exactly. And I think, you know, that that word is apt, right? Conversation. I think often there's not enough conversation. There's too much immediate vilification. And it comes from this absolutist idea that is bad, wrong. And so basically you're wiped off at that point.
Yeah. Cancel culture is a thing, you know, like cancel, that person's done, you know, like how do we remove them from public life and deplatform them? And I'm like, that's actually, I don't think that's fair a lot of the time.
Yeah, we had a discussion on the HPN members group. So it's a closed group.
Mm-hmm.
So I won't go into too much detail because obviously we keep that sort of private. But it was basically about the idea that there were children who were giving speeches about veganism and how, you know, people should switch to veganism for all these various reasons. But the sort of point of contention was they were saying that meat is murder. And
I have a T-shirt that says that. It's a classic line from the Smiths song.
Exactly. Yeah. But people were sort of saying, well, these kids shouldn't be allowed to say that, and the teacher should have stepped in and things like that. And you know, I'm an omnivore, obviously, and quite proudly so. But
you used to be vegan, though, right? I think when I met you
had I was practically vegan. I wasn't 100% vegan because I don't eat a lot of eggs, but I do have some milk. But I had drifted towards not having milk or any dairy either because it was sort of affecting my Crohn's. So I was a strict vegetarian for about 7 years. Probably for a couple of those I was vegan. But yeah, I went back for various reasons, which we can talk about. But I sort of stepped into these threads and said, hold on, I think we need to allow kids in particular, anyone really, but kids in particular, to explore this, because I was that person saying meat is murder and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. We need to allow people to explore and discuss openly and say somewhat controversial things, but as long as it's not becoming ad hominem, I think that there is value to having
robust discussion.
Robust discussion, exactly. Because we can't just shut people off. We can't censor people because then we've got this moralistic right versus wrong. And that's too gray because life is nuanced.
And hey man, like what's right, what's true for me isn't always going to be what's true for you. You know, like I think we need to learn to live I think we need to learn to live in agreeing to disagree somewhat. You know, like for our own personal peace of mind. You know, like you can spend your whole life trying to convince people that your way of doing things is the best way of doing things. I think there are absolute truths that we need to accept. This is sexism. This is racism, etc., etc. This is what classism is like.
But there is nuance within that.
There is nuance within that, but you know, those things I would argue are always going to be inherently wrong, and we should
Absolutely
rail against them. How they manifest, that's where the nuance is saying guys addressing a mixed sex crowd. Is that an example of sexism, or is that just how language is changed? Do you know what I mean? Like
exactly.
Yeah, like
but if we couldn't have that discussion because someone was saying no, it's wrong. You can't say guys.
Yeah, I know, and that's the thing, because dude, it gets tricky, man. Like, but you know, there are absolutes in that too. You know, like we don't use the N word and yada 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 when we're talking about racism, and I think you're right in that all people should be allowed to bring those conversations to the fore, and we should have those conversations. But it's how you do it. Like increasingly, I'm learning it's not what we're saying, but how we're saying that. You know, I was just watching the latest viral outrage video of some vegan protesters who stormed into a restaurant with like signs and placards, and you know, people were just having dinner, and a grown man like assaulted this woman, like punched in the face, and which is wrong. And I hope he gets, you know, when we're thinking about criminal justice sanctions, I think he deserves a criminal justice sanction, you know. But at the same time, and this is not victim blaming, I'm just saying, if you want people to go vegan, storming into their fucking restaurant and telling them that they're terrible people isn't going to do it. That's actually not going to do it. They're just going to think you're a lunatic fringe. And there are better ways to draw attention to your cause than making people feel bad about themselves for things they've probably not considered.
Even that I'm somewhat on the fence about. I think probably that's a slightly extreme example, but you know, the protesters in the supermarket.
Oh yeah, sure. These were the same protesters, or at least the same organization.
I kind of think that's, from my point of view, that's almost justified to go into a supermarket and protest, so long as you're not, you know, hurting anyone. It's also justified for the supermarket to say, okay, enough's enough, you're trespassing, get out.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it's all good, in my opinion.
Right. Well, this is interesting, because I've been a vegetarian for 20 years, you know, like, and I've never fully met.
Are you vegan?
No, people think I'm vegan because I eat a lot of vegan food, and I'm like #vegan because different companies send me vegan products, and I eat a lot of vegan food, but I'm not strict vegan, you know, like I for a range of reasons, you know, but I'm endeavoring to be more vegan, and that's easier and easier as restaurants emerge and products emerge and yada yada yada. But I'm not strict vegan. I never have been. I just eat a lot of vegan food, you know.
And what's your primary motivation for that?
For eating more vegan food?
For being vegetarian, for being vegan, for sort of moving that way?
Yeah, cool, man. So when I was like, got into the New York hardcore scene, and which is hardcore is a style of music that comes from the punk scene. It's real funny because I have to do this like explain this all the time now, because now I'm an educator around pornography. And once someone was like, former sex performer and porn actor Richie Hardcore. I legally changed my name to Hardcore, right? Like it's my middle name. I'm Richie Hardcore Stewart, right?
Yeah.
And people in that space think that I used to be in hardcore porno. I'm like, nah, dude. Like hardcore is a music style. I did a radio show called Viva La Hardcore. Hardcore is my ring name. It's all like this funny thing. Anyway. Point being, the hardcore scene used to be very politicized, continues to be politicized, and a lot of the bands would sing about animal rights and the environmental impact of them. And it just made sense to me as a young idealistic person that if I want the world to be different and I feel angry about these things, I need to take some actions myself. So yeah, a lot of the bands were singing about animal rights or rainforests getting deforested and all the shit that we sing in the news now 20 years later.
Yeah.
And so I started cutting out beef and then chicken and then fish and then shellfish. And then I started looking at, oh, okay, well, I should probably not eat tallow and animal fats and then gelatin and rennet, and tried to just reduce my impact. Like, none of us are perfect. Everyone's diet, even if you're vegan, has some sort of detrimental impact on the world around us. But I wanted to make less of an impact. So yeah, like, while just existing, I'm bad for the planet. I'm trying the best that I can to have a lighter impact on the earth. So there was an environmental component. And then, man, we would watch like VHS videos and stuff of how mainstream agriculture treats animals. And it made me it just made me really sad emotionally. Like, I would cry, like, watching Earthlings or any of those sorts of documentaries. And I was like, man, like, I'm never going to be perfect. Everything I do is going to hurt other things. But if I can reduce the amount of suffering that I cause other animals, like, I might as well try. Yeah. So those are my main reasons. I don't think being vegetarian or vegan is inherently healthier than having an omnivorous diet. Because I know some real out of shape vegans, man. I'm like, yo, dude, put on the treats and the carbohydrates, you know. But for me, I found that people who just think more explicitly about their diet tend to be healthier. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a big factor. You know, I think there's a big debate, you know, currently about the impact of meat on mortality. And I think we're actually missing the point. I think there are bigger issues, and I think the ecological issues are the ones we really need to be looking at most. And I think animal welfare is obviously critical to the debate. But I think when it comes to health and the impact of red meat in particular on mortality, we're looking at such tiny risk ratios.
Yeah.
We can't actually tease out the statistical noise. You know, when people hear something like you have a 6% increased risk of dying through eating red meat, it's not actually completely accurate. What it means is a 1.06 risk ratio, and the 95% confidence intervals might be 1.01 to 1.09. What that basically means is that there's practically nothing there. And when we start to tease out, like I've done this in some of my reviews of the research, we've started to tease out, you know, other confounding influences. Like, let's say you go to your doc and you've got high cholesterol. So they say we should reduce your red meat and also stop drinking so much and stop smoking and exercise more, all this kind of stuff. We see a really strong association between people who reduce red meat and improving all other lifestyle factors.
Yeah. And it's all of those things, right?
So I'm not advocating for people to just eat lots and lots of red meat. What I'm saying is that's probably not the biggest issue. What we need to do is eat more plants.
Yeah.
Base our diet on that and eat more nutrient-dense foods.
Yeah.
The ultra-refined stuff is our problem.
Yeah. And while I have my ethical views around plants and that, eating lots of plants and that, yeah, you're right. You know, like if I was eating a vegan diet of just fucking burgers and chips and there's no animals getting killed, it's still going to be bad for me, right? And I think that's the thing, is that a lot of fast food is meat-based, like KFC and McDonald's and all of that. But they're starting to put vegan options in there, you know? But the thing is like, you can buy a Big Pen pie at any dairy. And so people tend to do that. It's when you start cutting out the processed foods, that's when your health changes for the better, whether you're eating a vegetarian vegan diet or an omnivorous diet, right?
Exactly. And that's also where I think there's a big overlap between, you know, some of the ultra-refined, ultra-processed vegan foods I'm a bit worried about as well, because I've done some analysis whereby the cost to life is quite high and the ecological impact is quite high. So, you know, if someone's going to go vegan or vegetarian, I'm fully supportive of that if it's a natural unprocessed diet, you know.
I think because so. You're talking about like Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger and things like that.
Yeah, well, I did it was very perfunctory because it's very difficult. I mean, it's so complex, it's very difficult to analyze. But I did an analysis, for example, of soy versus beef, And the idea was I chose soy because it's the most calorific and the highest in protein and stuff like that. So I wanted to have a true comparison. I didn't want to compare to like wheat because that just wouldn't be fair. And the cost to life of beef might be the same or lower than soy. Now, I know that that's a very controversial topic, and I know that that's something that people have discussed ad nauseum, right? But I think, again, the only reason I posit things like that is purely for discussion point, because I think it's too easy just to jump from a highly processed diet that includes meat to a highly processed diet that includes, say, soy or other things, and expect for it to be better when we don't actually know, because monoculture farming is pretty damaging as well, ecologically, right? Like in terms of ecosystem damage, monoculture farming is massive. So what I typically end up going back to, I'm sorry, I'm rambling now, is
no, it's all right.
I think appropriate land usage is really important, because, you know, what we've often seen is we have factory farming of animals, which is abhorrent, and we have land that's forced into various monocultures, particularly in places like Africa, where it's just unsuitable for that, and in the rainforest, where it's really unsuitable for that. If we were appropriately using land, which might include, from my point of view, some free pasturing on land that's appropriate for it, there's actually there's possibly benefits to having that. So I still think that meat should be a smaller portion of the diet when compared to vegetables. But, you know, like the UC Davis research, which showed that pasture in places that are prone to forest fires is a way better carbon sink. And that's because the pasture can burn off, and that's fine. It doesn't release as much carbon, but the root systems and the carbon sequestering is still really high. Whereas when you burn down a forest, it releases so much fucking carbon, and there's not as much sequestered in the land. So that's just an example. People have taken that to mean, well, pasture's better than forest. Well, no, it's not, because they didn't read the nuance, which was it's in fire-prone areas.
That's I think, speaking about everything that we've been talking about today, there isn't a lot of space for nuance anymore, you know? No,
exactly.
Particularly because so much communication about very complicated ideas, whether it's about social justice issues or dietary issues or animal rights issues, happens on the internet, where there's no tone of voice. Like I know you personally. Like, I love you as a friend. You know, like I care about your well-being. You know, but sometimes you and me, I can tell that you're annoyed at me, like through the internet. You're like, "Yo, fuck this guy," and I'm like, "Fuck Cliff's." Like, what's he talking about? You know, like, am I fair in saying that? But if we were having the same conversation in person, our feelings probably wouldn't rise up like that. And I think there's such a problem with this day and age, because it leads to very real mental health struggles for a lot of people. And we need to learn how to, I don't know what the answer is. You use emojis more? I'm not sure. Like winky face, I was joking, you know, or like yellow heart thing, you know, like I'm not sure how we can have these important conversations that we do need to discuss, and at the same time do it in a kind way and agree to disagree.
I think one of the things that this is all leading to, I'm going to say one thing first, though, before I get into that. You're dead right. And I think I've had people say to me, "You must hate that Richie guy."
Oh,
and
really?
They think we're like enemies, right?
Because I'm like, well, have you considered this data point? And you're like, have you considered this data point?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So people think because we're opposed on some issues, we're not even opposed. That's what people don't realize. But
we just look at it from a different viewpoint, right?
Because we debate some issues, people think, "Oh, you must hate that guy."
Yeah.
The reality is, when we debate, I might get fucked off with you. But I
appreciate you being so honest about it. That's funny.
But I don't think you're a fuckwit, right?
Yeah.
What I'm fucked off with you and the fact that I'm feeling something because you've kind of triggered me, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that's good in itself, but we're also taking a step back and saying, well, I love Richie. He's a good guy.
Oh, thanks.
And at the end of the day, if I step back from it, I think, well, what I always do when we have a discussion is I'll always take on board what you say and think, well, how does that challenge my beliefs? Because my beliefs are my beliefs. They're not facts. They're my beliefs. They might be based on evidence or facts, but it's still my interpretation of it. So how does that challenge me? And hey, I could be wrong. And I'm prepared to stand up and say, the things that I believe to be true, particularly with respect to the impact of animals on the environment, I don't know if I'm 100% correct. I think what I think based on the evidence, but I need people like you to challenge me, because then I can actually be more nuanced and be better over time.
And I'm the same with people who disagree with me. Like like broadly speaking, I'm like, okay, well, I've not considered that aspect before, and yada yada yada, and it encourages me to stay curious and to stay open-minded. And like we were saying earlier, you're like, no one's got all the answers, and you don't know what you don't know, and you need to be open-minded if you want to understand your own values more. You know,
even really inflammatory things. You know, I had a mutual friend of ours, 80, was being trolled online by a racist, right?
80 was really?
Yeah, like, because she had posted something, and he basically posted back all this apparently research of why black people are less intelligent than white people, right?
Yeah.
And it's crazy.
I can feel my emotional response coming up.
Exactly. And I immediately start jumping in and defending her, right?
Yeah.
Or defending the position, you know, because he's just wrong. But I still read the stuff that he was posting, because I was like, you know, where is this coming from?
Yeah. All that scientific racism stuff, like Stephen Molyneux and all of that, right?
Exactly. Which, you know, I'm not a social scientist, but at least I have some understanding of research and methods and stuff like that. I'd look at that and say, hold on, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And that's important to do. I've watched a couple of those videos when I've seen similar situations.
Yeah.
And I found it really upsetting, because I know so many people watch that bullshit and believe it because they don't have critical filters or a social science background and understand context, and they understand social causatives of human behavior, which is my academic leaning. Like I did political science and sociology and shit like that at university. And so I'm also have to be like, I'm privileged enough to have got a fucking higher education. Maybe I shouldn't call this person a fuckwit, you know, like.
But that's another thing, right? Privilege doesn't exist, apparently.
Well, it does, though. Even that.
You know, I'm kidding. Right?
Yeah. I know you're kidding. Yeah. No. I know that. You know what I mean? Like, you know, I didn't have the easiest of childhoods. You know, my father's alcoholic. That's very well publicized, and there's a fair degree of dysfunction in my childhood. But even with all of that, I still had a whole bunch of head starts that allowed me to kind of, I guess, end up doing all right. Like I've reasonable middle class life, you know, like I'm, you know, like I never gone hungry, you know, my parents were both very literate and encouraged my literacy and taught me how to use the library and let me read books and bought me toys and all this sort of stuff. There are other things that mean that I've had a history of like chaotic romantic relationships due to my internal conditioning, but fucking, you know, on a nuts and bolts privilege level, you got to take that shit into account. You know what I mean? And that's all the stuff that doesn't transmit when we're debating people on the internet, you know, and that's a hard thing, man. Like, but at the same time, like, if someone is spreading racist ideology based on faux science, we do need to challenge that, you know.
Absolutely.
But it's how do you challenge it in a way that doesn't create more division? That's the fucking hard one.
I think one thing that I often post to my groups and to my students and things is the Wikipedia page on logical fallacies.
Okay.
Yeah, like ad hominem and stuff like that. You know, like all those various things that we can fall into doing to try and strengthen our position, but in fact, they're not actually helping the debate.
No, they're not. They make you look like you're winning, but maybe it's not to win. Maybe we just need to learn to understand more. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one thing that I think is super interesting in that whole discussion is I personally, I don't know if you agree with this, but I personally believe that intersectionalism is misunderstood.
Okay.
Because people kind of think, well, it's just a sum game of certain things. So if I'm female and I'm black and I'm a lesbian, then I've basically got cumulative disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's deeper than that, because I don't think we look at the range of how intersectional advantage can be. I personally think the biggest advantage someone can have nowadays, the biggest privilege they can have, is just purely wealth, endemic wealth.
Yeah.
And fame and celebrity is another massive factor and advantage. And there will be contexts in which certain things that would be systemically or societally disadvantageous are advantageous. It's very complex. But what a lot of people have taken that to mean is that it anymore. And I think most of us would agree that that is just empirically false, because like you and I, growing up as white middle-class men, and now I'm a white middle-aged man.
yeah, I know.
I'm pretty much every advantage in the world, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not stupid enough to deny that, because implicit bias exists, even if systemic bias has been broken down a lot, thankfully.
Sure. So what's I'm not sure if there's a question to that.
It was more of a discussion.
Yeah, right.
It was more me just rambling.
No, yeah.
It's really about that idea of what's your take on that idea nowadays of privilege versus advantage and disadvantage, and how some people are positing that that doesn't exist, and others are basically making it the cross on which
so are you asking, is it we've perhaps focused too much on identity politics rather than socioeconomic class politics? In that we kind of, because for me, like trying to follow things, how we talk about justice, I don't see that much of a classist analysis of society in a way that, I'm 39 now. I'm middle-aged.
You're there, brother.
Yeah, I know, bro. 40 next year. Shit.
But I'm going to live to 120, so I'm only a third of the way through my life.
Really? I'm good. I don't want to get that old. Tap me out at 80. When I went through university, and I just been through Latin America, and I was so emotionally upset by the poverty I saw. That was a legacy of colonialism and neoliberal capitalism and free markets and fucking all this bullshit. That's what I went to study at uni. I wanted to understand why some people are so economically disadvantaged and when there's so much economic injustice. And we had this big, you look at like socialism, capitalism, and you look at those, and I don't see that discussion as much, at least in the spaces I find myself in online. Yeah. Whereas I do see a big, like identity politics discussions are ubiquitous now. And while I do agree that we need to be mindful of like structural intersectional oppressions, there is a degree of like, well, you can be born into an affluent family and be a person of color and be well off compared to someone who's born into disadvantages despite their identity privileges. And but broadly across the board, I think we need to speak to those biases that you're talking about. You are treated preferentially, however subconsciously, due to your skin color and your sex and your sexuality, and we need to. I think it's not an either or. I guess that's what I would argue in response to you. I think it's not an either or. We need to take all those things into account to figure out why the world is the way it is, and look at how do we have interventions that look for not equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome. And that means treating people depending on their, the situations that they're born into that are beyond their control, Like, I think I'm big on, like, affirmative action. I'm big on, like, funding initiatives that take people who have been historically marginalized out of that context for however long it takes, Some people are like, well, how long is it going to take until we get over the Treaty of Waitangi? And I'm like, well, fuck, I don't have an answer to that.
As long as it
takes.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't just snap out of generations of suffering and abuse and social dislocation and disenfranchisement like that because of one government policy. It takes a long, long time, and we should all be on board with that. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. And I think you've actually described it better than I was trying to, right? It's that contextual stuff around various types of advantage and how it's situational. I think is
Yeah.
the main thing, right? It is very situational. And that's actually, I think that's a really interesting under-recognized factor because, for example, I was looking at demographics in the US, and although people of color are way overrepresented in poverty statistics, there are still way more poor white people.
Yeah, and
as a proportion, it's a lot lower. And so there's a problem there. But what that also has meant is that you can see why the rise of someone like Donald Trump occurred, because he's such a populist.
Yeah. That's a really good point. It is like that's a really good point to consider, because you are structurally disadvantaged if you're a person of color, and you're a much higher representation in all the negative social statistics. If you think of prison populations, you think of like treatment when it comes to arrests for like drugs, you know, like you can be, if you're arrested and you're white, and you're arrested if you're black, and you're far more likely to go to jail for exactly the same drugs if you're black. And that's a gross injustice, and we need to change the world so that doesn't happen. But you're right, by weight of numbers, there is still a whole bunch of white people who have been shut out of the system or fallen through the cracks and are recreating cycles of trauma or whatever it is. And we forget about that because statistically, right? Is that that's the point you're making?
Yeah.
And so you're right. And that's how you get Donald Trump's in power. It's a really good point, Cliff. That's a really good point. And
I think it also means
I don't have an answer for that though, apart from looking at some more of their, how do you create a more equitable economic system so the 1% isn't fucking running the shit.
Yeah. And I think with identity politics, the way it is, I think often, as I think you suggested, we're actually missing what the next clear and present danger, which is going to be, is that we do have increasing wealth disparity.
Ever increasing. It's insane. Like, if you can track that from 1973 onwards, you know, if you look at like Reaganomics, Thatcheronomics, Rogernomics here in New Zealand, all those neoliberal policies, that's the sort of stuff that I was interested in when I was doing my university studies. And I'm not a fucking genius. Like, I'm not an economist or anything like that. I just have like a degree of working knowledge. But that's the stuff that I think we do need to look at. You know, we've been talking about mental health. We've been talking about all these sorts of things. There is a huge and growing body of data that looks at that inequality, that inequality economically within a society, which you have to then add all those structural identity politics oppressions on top of, that leads to poor outcomes. But that inequality in and of itself, taking away people's skin color, yada, 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 leads to a whole range of like mental health issues, violence issues, substance abuse issues. And then on top of that, then you've got, how do we treat people of sexual minorities? Well, we treat them worse. How do we treat people of color? We treat them worse. How do we treat women? We treat them worse. You know, like, so it's a super layered thing, and it shouldn't be one or the other, but quite often it becomes positioned as one or the other.
Yeah.
I think people don't know how to, is concurrent the right word? Hold those conversations concurrently, or at this? Because we can address economic inequality and a shitty economic system at the same time as addressing racism and sexism, and we need to. And there are overlaps between that. Like, if like black women get paid less than white women, like, that's a simple one. You know, like, how do you fix that so that you've got the economic equation, but at the same time you've got the racial equation addressed too? You know? Yeah. I think we need to, as I guess people who want the world to be better, I guess we're all on the same team with that. Like,
I hope so.
Well, that's the thing. There are people who argue against this. There are people who are like, fucking structural racism is not a thing. People argue that. People argue that we have gender equality. People are like, why do we have International Women's Day? We don't have International Men's Day. You know, like, there are fucking a million people like that. You know, like, there are hundreds of millions. There are fucking billions of people like that who are.
And maybe that's growing.
Yeah, and the internet doesn't help with that, unfortunately. Because if you're lonely and you're fucking on the internet all the time and you're stressed out and you're poor and you don't have an education And then here's some meme, and here's some tropes, and here's some clever guy on the internet who sounds real smart on his YouTube channel, and you can get drawn into that. Then it just there's a radicalization that goes through that goes through those channels, you know, like people getting shifted one way or the other. Via I don't know, misinformation that's intentional, and that's really dangerous.
And I think we need to understand those particular situations. Like I've had many discussions about this with my old man. He came from a poor working class family up north, but he's white, right? But he was frustrated when he was younger, and he understands that there's more to it now. But he was frustrated when he was younger because he was from a poor family. My granddad shoveled coal in the railway yards, you know, and when he went for a bank loan, he couldn't get one. But there were dispensations for Māori from the area who could get easier bank loans. And he can obviously see the broader social context for that. But on an individual level, he still felt like, shit, we're all from the same school. You know, we live in the same houses, and I'm not afforded the opportunity. Now, I think you and I would agree that, hey, there needs to be that affirmative action. But we can also understand on an individual level why some people would not benefit from that as well. And that's one of the inconvenient truths of trying to lift things up.
I know, that's a hard one. I don't have an answer to that.
But he would still benefit implicitly, and we've had many discussions at length about this, him and I, from being a white male.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's going to be some...
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing about New Zealand. I think your family history probably is indicative of this as well. I was looking back through some of the demographic data in the UK from sort of 100, 200 years ago, and there were very few people of color in the UK, right? The black population in the UK was very low until there was the diaspora back from the West Indies and places like that. Previous to that, there were only a couple of thousand black people in the UK.
Okay.
So because of that, there was actually very little day-to-day racism based on color. That's actually something that's come more from the US experience because it was very much framed with respect to color there. Most of the discrimination was ethnicity-based, you know, against, say, Jews or against Romani people, and based on classism.
Yeah.
Where I'm going with this is it's interesting because obviously on my mum's side, I'm Romani. My grandparents came out here from the UK, and they would have, particularly my grandmother and her forebears, would have suffered extreme institutional racism in the UK. But coming across here, where it wasn't really a thing to be a gypsy, you're just English. They benefited from being white English people. And that's an interesting nuance too, because if you don't look like something, you don't necessarily suffer the implicit bias.
Yeah, but internally you have a thing, right? Like your perception of the world is still Romani. Like you feel affronted when people say the word gypsy and you're cognizant of all these sorts of things. You know what I mean?
Well, in an appropriative sense, and mainly because there is still, like in Europe, Romani people are the most disadvantaged.
Yeah, exactly.
Like 90% of Romani are at risk of poverty versus I think 20% of other Europeans.
Yeah, and because my mother's family is from Lebanon, right? I look white. I mean, I get a great fucking tan in summertime. Thanks to my Lebanese heritage. Yeah. My slick back hair, my penchant for kickboxing, you know, like, and my grandfather, who's 100% Lebanese, like, did experience like a hard time based on his race at high school in the fucking I don't know how should these pass, but do you know what I mean? Like, when 9/11 happened, my family did get treated different at the airport. Like, seriously.
Yeah.
Because of the way that they looked, and some of my extended family, like first generation immigrants, and have, you know, Lebanese citizenship or passports or whatever the fuck, you know. But I don't look Lebanese, so I don't.
Yeah.
I get treated preferentially as a white person, right? But at the same time, I'm still cognizant of how it feels to be discriminated against. Like when I lived in Melbourne a long time against, used to live in Australia, and casual racism there about Lebanese people, Arab people, is like next level, dude. At least when where I used to work, which was like this dead end job, and I, for the first time in my life, because it's not a thing here in New Zealand, I've never been around people who are like Lebo's this and Wog's that. But then it really upset me, and I got in some gnarly arguments like, "Yo, fuck you, man!" Like, because my family's like that, you know. What I mean? Like, and I'm actually grateful for that experience, because it makes me think of how people of color in New Zealand must feel when we use racial epithets and casual racism around like Pacific Islanders and Māori, and it makes me think of that. And so while I'm structurally advantaged because I'm white passing, even though I identify as Lebanese Pākehā, like, I think it's important to fucking have had those difficult conversations. Like, hey man, when you say wog or when you say lebos, like in the context that you're using it, it's offensive and diminutive and stereotypical. Does that make?
It's a really, really good point. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting distinction between the structural advantage that we might experience because of the way we look and are perceived, versus that justified outrage on behalf of people we know or people in the world that are still happening to.
That's the other thing. It is people like, okay, so you and me are white passing, we have all these privileges because we're white. Like, I've had a number of like long-term romantic relationships with people of color, like people I like love profoundly, and have told me about what it was like to be called a racist term as a child and how that's impacted them, or what growing up in the fucking 80s and 90s was like. And there's no people of color in advertising on the TV in positive ways, and how that impacts your self-esteem. And like, I personally really empathize with how that must feel, and I know explicitly how that's impacted these people's lives, and it makes me angry on their behalf when I encounter racism. And I think people like us who do have an advantage in life because we're white, we're required to use that privilege. I don't always get it right. Like, I don't necessarily always have the language or knowledge, but I feel like at the same time, if someone's being racist, like you encountered on the internet the other day, we should challenge that and push back against that, because we do have those structural advantages, and people do treat us differently because of being white fucking men. Like the fact that I do so much work in feminist spaces, it's not lost on me that feminists who are women have been saying the same shit I've been saying in perhaps slightly different terms for a long time. But I get a lot more cut through, particularly with men, because I'm a man, and that sucks. But I need to use my privilege to that end until that changes. And sometimes people take that the wrong way, like you're trying to like own the space. But I was just watching an interview with one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter the other day, and they were like, look, racism, we need white people to use their voice. I've heard 1,000,001 like active feminists say we need men to use their voice. And so if you have privilege, like you and I have privilege, I think we need to use it to the betterment of society, not for our own self-aggrandizement and our own ego and our own validation. And I think that's something that I'm mindful of checking, because you do get like a lot of people like, oh, you're so great, I wish all men would say shit like that. It's like, yo, that's not why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this because I want to impress you. I'm doing it because I've talked to 1,000,001 women who've told me about being sexually assaulted, or they're scared, or yada yada yada, and I want that to change. I want my stepson to grow up in a world where women don't feel like that. I want him to grow up
where he can be a better man.
He can be a better man. I want a role model of that. And I want people of color to not have to put up with fucking racist jokes and not getting a bank loan. I mean, it's an interesting one what you talked about, but like, we do preferentially treat white people in the criminal justice system, and I want all that shit to change, man. And so I think if we can have 1,000,001 constructive conversations when we have the opportunity, it's part and parcel of making that world, right? I hope.
And I think that
I spend a lot of time and energy doing it, so I fucking hope it's worth something.
Well, it's a function of the way society is now, that there is going to be extraordinary benefit from someone like yourself, maybe someone like me, but
Whatever.
probably even more so
Don't be
someone
self-offensive.
like you, who is, you know, unashamedly a man, right? And I'm not saying that I'm saying that in a somewhat trite way, but, you know, the societal perception of a man, someone who's been a fighter and an
Oh
athlete,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, all that kind of stuff.
Heaps of tattoos. Yeah, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges we possibly have now, and you might disagree, is that there is a worrying rise, I think, in the whole sort of alpha male type archetype movement, right?
Mm,
Where you've got to be alpha, you've got to be better than the beta man, and you've got to
mm,
be a real hyper masculine kind of asshole to be a man.
mm.
And I always just laugh. Like I was talking about this with Bella the other day. Someone posted something on a thread that I was involved in about, you know, keep being alpha or whatever. And I clicked on his profile and it was like really horrible misogynistic shit.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to get into an argument with the dude. So I just said, don't be scared, bro. It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because it's like, what the fuck are you trying to do?
Yeah,
you know?
I think there's I think a lot of men are being really challenged by our deconstruction of stereotypical masculinity. And so they're over alphaing, do you know? But the thing is, it's like everything. It's not one or the other. You can still like fucking drinking beer and having having casual sex and in a respectful, consensual kind way. I don't do that either. And
I've got a girlfriend.
Yeah, me too.
I love my girlfriend. That's enough for me.
And lifting weights and doing stereotypically male associated things, and at the same time be respectful of women and be vulnerable and nurturing and do your fair share of shit around the house and fucking be a broader conception of what it is to be a man. And basically that's just being a person. That's good. But quite often, do you know what I mean? Like we gender way too many behaviors. And I think it's all getting a bit confused. People are getting a bit confused and then getting messed up and saying, like, on one end, it's like people are mixing up gender and sex, which are quite different things, like male bodies different from female bodies. And we need to acknowledge that in some circumstances, like sport, for example, I would argue. And at the same time, when it comes to behaviors, men cry, boys cry, men get sad, women are assertive and leaders, and we need to not gender those sorts of things. You know what I mean? Like, we shouldn't call girls bossy for being assertive. We shouldn't call guys. We shouldn't call boys girls for crying. You know?
Yeah.
So I think that pushback of all the men's rights movement and fucking incels and like really, really ugly stuff. That deeply embedded patriarchy, that pushback. That worries me. It worries me that there are huge segments of the internet where men are talking about methodologies to gaslight women and fucking, what do you call it? Neg. There's that whole like negging thing.
Yeah, that's all that gaming.
Yeah, all that gaming, all these weird ways to like get women into bed and to use them for sex. Like that's really hateful and patriarchal and misogynistic. And I'm trying to figure out like what happened in those people's lives that they've got such a warped view about women and sex and relationships. And I do understand some of it.
They've probably been hurt.
Yeah, but a lot of them may well have been, but which of us hasn't? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a negative reaction.
To that hurt, it's
right?
not like I've never had a woman hurt my feelings, but at the same time, I've hurt women's feelings. Like I'm a human being, man. I've made mistakes. I've been hurtful. I've done hurtful actions, things I regret. But at the same time, I've endeavored to learn from those mistakes and be a better man and a better person and a better boyfriend and in the future. And some people are just like they quit out and then they join a weird fucking online hate group, you know? And it's like, how does that happen? And I worry about that. And again, it goes back to this theme through our conversation today. Is like a lot of this stuff is virtual, you know, like that whole incel movement is virtual, but it leads to real life violence. It leads to people in those movements taking extreme actions, you know, like the Christchurch shooter, you know, from the limited amount that I understand, like a lot of his ideology stems from involvement in movements that have a strong base online. And you know, he even like streamed his fucking massacre to
like a first-person shooter
like
game.
a first-person shooter game to a virtual audience, and was validated for that. So we really need to like figure out like how do we put a stop to that stuff.
Well, I mean, just an aside to that is on looking at a few of these sites and things, it also seems to me to be incredibly exhausting.
Be online. But that's the thing. People are fucking hooked on the internet. People are lonely.
Yeah.
People are lonely, dude. People are lonely, and they'll come home and they'll get on this fucking thing and stay there for hours, you know, and then they'll wake up, go to their job that doesn't really fulfill them. They'll wake up single. They'll wake up like with all these gaping emotional holes that we know we can fill with human connection, exercise, meaningful purpose, volunteering, getting into nature more.
Massive.
You know, like we can fill those holes, but in a positive way that builds us up. But quite often what's easiest is to jump on the internet and then you go down some rabbit hole and then you're on that enough, and it kind of is the self-fulfilling prophecy. I feel like this, and here's a guy on the internet who's good with words pointing out all the reasons that I'm right for feeling like this, and that's really damaging. I've read some quite interesting articles about how even the YouTube algorithm can lead people down with the sidebar rabbit holes from one viewpoint that, you know, you start looking at Jordan Peterson, and then you're looking at Stephen Molyneux, and then you're looking at some fucking Nazi site. You know, like it's this descend into the darkness, and we need to figure out a way to like bring people into the light. And I'm not entirely sure how to do that.
It's also that the headlines and the narrative itself are controversial by nature because that drives clicks, obviously.
Yeah, no, even mainstream media, like our biggest news organizations will find the most inflammatory pull-out quote and click that. Then you know what? We live in a society where motherfuckers don't even read the whole story anymore. So someone can get completely taken out of context by a headline and like the first paragraph. And I just want to say, I'm sorry I said motherfuckers. I apologize. That's a word that I'm trying.
Don't apologize on this show.
Well, I'm trying to take the gender out of that. I'm trying to just say,
I see. Right.
I'm trying to just say fuckers, you know. But hey, you know, I'm trying to unlearn.
That's discriminatory against people who like to have sex a lot.
I'm trying to change that term of phrase. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, it's a hard one. Like mainstream media has got a lot to answer for when it comes to the polarization and real violence that emerges from that, because they're part of the problem with the way that they the way they monetize outrage.
And I think I'll tell you a little story, actually. I think this is really cool. I was having a pretty hard time. It was probably a few months ago now. I had one of my sort of dips. You know, I've had bipolar and had a bit of a dip. And, you know, stopped sort of training and just wasn't well, right? So I felt like I needed, as I started to come back a little bit, needed to get out of the house and see my community again and shit like that. So I went back to jiu-jitsu. And one of the guys there, I had a bit of a heart-to-heart with him, and he said, "Oh, you should read this book, Lost Connections. Have you read it by Johan Hari?"
I'm like biblical with that book. I'm like, here, take one. You know, like I love that book.
Such a good book, right? And I know, you know, it's been criticized because not everything it says is 100% correct, but who gives a fuck? I mean, on balance,
I think on balance, it's brilliant. Yeah,
scientifically valid. Yeah, and I think it's a really good book. But it was really interesting that I went to what some people see as a hyper masculine community, and it's not. And chatted with a dude who is a like legit high level fighter about my feelings. And he recommended a book, which was fucking awesome.
Yeah.
And it helped to kickstart this thing. And it was indicative of the book's theme itself, which is real connection.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's been a bloody good theme for the day, I think.
Well, that's the thing, though. People are like, oh, if you're into martial arts, you're into weightlifting, you can't talk about A, B, and C. But that's wrong. You know, like, I think we all need to not just, if we're going to try and summarize this, we need to like all not just judge people on a surface level and also allow people to be complete and whole human beings across a broad spectrum of feelings and behaviors and beliefs. And what might appear on the surface to be paradoxical actually isn't. You can be into A, B, and C, and at the same time have belief system A, B, and C. It's not one or the other. And I think people are constantly trying to simplify their experience of the world and put people into boxes and blame and shame and attack based on those boxes, rather than be compassionate and broad-minded. And the internet is part and parcel of that, and exacerbates that. And man, we need to reflect on that and adjust ourselves accordingly. Every time we read something and we see someone's profile and it fits a box, maybe we need to like bite our fingers for a minute before we say fuck you, and reflect on, what did you mean by that? Or why do you think that? Or what leads you to say that? And then go from there.
And you can disagree with someone and still respect them, or
point.
Similarly, you can you can disagree with someone on most things and also see where they've provided value.
Well, what do we want to do? Do we just want to hang out with people who are fucking like clones of us? Like, no way. Like, I think diversity leads to a richer human experience. Like, I'm a fucking feminist, vegetarian, nearly vegan sometimes, teetotaler. Like, who the fuck am I going to hang out with? You know, like, if I didn't hang out with people like who are different to me. Like, most of my friends have got different values. My girlfriend has different values to me. Like, you know, like the people I care about the most have different values and lifestyles to me. Good number of my friends use way too many drugs, and I wish they wouldn't for their own sake, but it doesn't mean I love them any less. You know, good number of my friends, most of my friends fucking eat meat. Most of my friends, blah, 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 blah. Doesn't mean I don't love them. Yeah, I feel a bit alone and a bit isolated sometimes, but at the same time, like,
but you connect with what's most important.
Yeah, I connect with the humanity. Yeah.
Well, case in point, we can have an intelligent discussion. You're a vegan, feminist, teetotaler. I'm a meat-eating,
moderate beer drinking. Yeah,
moderate, very moderate actually, and entheogen using person.
Exactly. And I think it's a good note to finish on.
I think so.
Yeah. Thank you for being interested in talking with me. It's been really cool.
There's one final question that I've started asking people based on, I did a podcast with Danny Lennon, had me on his podcast a little while back, and he asked a really cool question, which I've started asking all my guests as well, which is that if you could, out of all the things that people could do to improve their lives, if they had to choose just one, so there's just one thing they could start to implement in their daily lives to improve their happiness, their lives in general, what would that be in your opinion?
I'd be better with money.
Interesting.
Because I'm really good with, I see a psychologist most weeks. I eat really well. I exercise daily. I'm emotionally vulnerable. I have pretty good social connections. What is a constant source of stress and leads me to work too much is that while I'm capable of earning money and my life's reasonably comfortable, I'm not very good at saving money or using it fairly. So, like, as soon as I get, like, a windfall, I'm like, fuck yeah, I'm off to UFC Melbourne on a week's notice, you know? And my life is fun and cool and shit like that, but I'm getting older and I don't own a home and I don't have a huge share portfolio and I'm responsible for a child and I want some degree of economic stability so I don't have to work as much as I do. And I think that ties into the fact that I am a bit of a workaholic, and that is a common feature of adult children of alcoholics.
Interesting.
So yeah, totally. You know, like, I think in a way I've kept myself emotionally safe throughout my life by being incredibly busy. I don't use alcohol and drugs and other things that are more dangerous, but I keep an emotional distance between myself and all people by being physically unavailable due to time constraints. And so I'll spend all my money and then work more, and then it's a cycle. So I think if I was better at not creating an environment of economic scarcity, I might work less and at the same time have more money in the bank to buy a house with one day.
Interesting. That's incredibly insightful. That's an answer I haven't had yet, but obviously financial insecurity has a massive association with mental health and even with physical health. So that's incredibly insightful. So thank you for sharing that, Richie. That's kind of a call to action, I think, for everybody.
If you're a financial advisor out there, help me save money.
Exactly.
Yo,
Contra for Muay Thai.
Yeah, I'll teach you Muay Thai. I'll come speak at your business about how to be healthy. You can help me save some of that money that you pay me. Yeah. Hey, brother. I just want to say it's been really cool, man, and thank you for the opportunity.
It's been awesome, Richie.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on. I have a vast list of other topics that we could have talked about, so I'll have to get you back on at some stage. But I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
If anyone listening out there wants to catch up with Richie and what he has to say, remember he's speaking at the Well Fed event in New Plymouth in just a few weeks' time. So check that out. I'll post up the link to that in the show notes and also the link to Richie's site and all the cool stuff that he does. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, bro. Nice to talk with you. Okay.
Awesome, bro.
Bye.
Thanks.